Welcome to episode 9 of At Home at Highclere for Viking.TV on a Friday. I think the view behind me is so familiar to you of the extraordinary golden castle. It was very much the colour of the stone of when the film was actually made here. Now, I suppose 18 months ago, and you all watched it last September. And here I am with some of my great friends, Alfie under the seat, Scooby next door to me, and Stella's hiding behind me, hoping for more tickles, I think. And I'm sitting underneath the cedar trees. So I wanted to share with you some of the stories in the background of these extraordinary trees, which are so much a feature of Highclere. Cedrus libani, they are gifts of God. The cones of the cedars of Lebanon were brought back by Bishop Pocock in the 1740s from Lebanon. Bishop Pocock actually spent part of his childhood here with the Herberts at Highclere, and he then travelled through the Middle East, and he brought back many cones, 400 of which were planted up as seedlings, and some of which survived and then were transplanted into the grounds around Highclere around about 1760, when they were sort of 15 foot tall. They let them grow firstly in the nursery before they transplanted. We are so lucky today, aren't we? Because those who planted them never saw these extraordinary trees. They'd have only seen drawings or sketches or paintings of them, and they'd have had to imagine what they might have looked like. And today they cast the spread of their branches across the lawns. They're dotted throughout the entire park, creating views and vistas and sort of centres of magnificent tree. Home to many birds, many insects, and when they fall over, the stumps and the network of roots underneath still provide a living repository of biodiversity for all the insects which rely upon them. This is our good fortune. We've planted more cedars of Lebanon for people to enjoy in the future, but I think it's going to take 100 years before they are really to be seen as these ones are today. There's 4 types of cedar. There's the Cedrus deodatus, which means gift of God. So Geordie and I have planted 2 or 3 of those because we always want God on our side, as well as the Libani and the Atlanticus. So we've got 3 of the types of cedar of Lebanon here at Highclere. I hope they look beautiful on camera, and I hope at some point, whether with a Viking cruise or separately, you'll come and walk under their extraordinary branches and come and enjoy the sense of just being with them and near them today. I've walked down the hill from the cedar tree into the wood of Goodwill, which is an amazing area which Geordie and I created probably about 15 years ago now. There was some softwoods here, but in the middle of it I knew there was the remains of Robert Herbert's 18th century more formal garden. So I'm standing in an avenue marked by beech trees, which leads to a stand at the end on which there would have been in one day a temple or a statue, and it marks the centre of this particular area. I was trying to think what to call this arboretum, and I really loved the idea of the wood of Goodwill, which I think one of my sisters, Georgie, suggested. It's all about kindness and caring both for trees, and it's actually peopled by trees which friends have given us. So it's such joy to walk around here in the evenings after work or first thing with the dogs in the morning. There's an avenue of beech tree, and then scattered through this area are 38 native British trees. I was amazed to find how few there were, given the number of exotic trees that the British tend to love to collect today. And like our typical English forebears and those who love gardens today, we've also planted some more exotic trees for variation and for different like the tulip tree, which has beautiful white blossoms, I suppose, flowers early in the year, to the cutleaf beech, to some of the more rare and unusual cornices and acers. So I hope it gives pleasure throughout the year. It's divided into 4 segments: spring, summer, autumn and winter. I was thinking of Vivaldi's 4 seasons, and I would love to have a Vivaldi concert here if I could only count on the British weather, but maybe I'll have to try and do it anyway. So it starts with spring, with all the spring blossoms in this side. It moves through into the summer. There's narcissi, daffodils and crocus underneath it, with camassias as well. It goes through into the autumn, which I'm looking at, which is behind you. And the autumn has got paroticas, smoke bushes, cornices and acers. And there's walks through it lined by euonymus, which has this really deep red colour. Then you go through a walnut walk. It's called the Six Sisters Walnut Walk, because I and my 5 sisters, there are 6 of us, have each planted a pair of walnut trees, and it leads to a rose arbour, which I've made in memory of our mother, Frances Aiken. So that's something I can share with you in a couple of weeks' time, but it's looking beautiful and full of hope. You then go through a more wild area and then out into a hill which leads you back up to the castle. So I hope in the summer, when we're open, in the spring, in the autumn and even in the winter, this area gives so much pleasure to so many visitors, and the dogs certainly really enjoy it. There's always things to do. Geordie and I were weeding here for a couple of hours last Sunday, which is very peaceful and gets us out, and the dogs love it because they kind of dig and garden and lie in the sun. They love drinking the water from the foot of all the beech trees here. There must be something particularly tasty in it. So it's a glorious area which I'm delighted to share with you, and I hope one day you'll visit us. Come on then. Come on, you two. Where should we sit? Evie? Good girl, Stella. Well, welcome back inside the castle for this 9th episode of At Home at Highclere with Viking this Friday. I hope you enjoyed the part outside in the Wood of Goodwill. And I've come back inside here because this, in a way, is Robert Herbert's room. He planted the avenue in the Wood of Goodwill, and this is the paintings in this room are what he brought to Highclere at the beginning of the 18th century. I don't think many of you would recognise this room from Downton Abbey, though, would you? And that's because it wasn't used. That was the tip on that one. This is the one room we held apart. It's next door to the drawing room, which is incredibly familiar to you. And in this room, we could put some of our more valuable pieces of works of art. So we could bring Napoleon's desk in here, some of the beautiful china vases in here, some of the china from the cabinets, so that if a lighting boom swung past when they were filming a wonderful scene with Lady Mary, it wasn't going to break our china, and they could rent their own china from a prop store. So whilst the paintings and the rooms as a whole were what is at Highclere, what I hope you might see one day, some of the china was not, just for safety. So this was full of trestle tables. Oh, thank you, Stella. She's just rubbing herself because she's just jumped out of a pond, so she's a little bit dirty, and I tried to clean her. Her sister was so dirty that I'm afraid she hasn't come in, but she's definitely a bit about grey and muddy around the edges. So back to the smoking room, which is where I'm sitting today. There's a table which you can't see, which is full of our wedding photographs, which is a little bit unfair. Geordie's grandfather, his parents and ourselves, and some of the family, and actually for all the beautiful paintings in the room. One of the things that people most enjoy is often the wedding photographs. I'm going to put Evie on my knee, then I know where she is. So this is Evie, who's one of my Cocker Spaniels, who just loves being patted, and she's got a really nice little quiff here as well. So there we go, I'm styling her as I talk. But back to the smoking room, which is where I'm sitting in. It's in what was the 18th century Georgian house. The coving and the door frames relate to the much earlier house. And on the walls in here are some truly fabulous paintings. So around the walls here is a wonderful selection of paintings, and it really relates to the grand tour of Europe. And to begin with, there's a wonderful painting about the mantel shelf, and I think you should see a painting of that come up on your screens. It's by Jan Felix. It's dated to the 17th century. It's one of the most important paintings in the house. The partner painting, if you like, hangs in the National Gallery. And this particular one is much treasured, although it's of a scene which is perhaps less popular today, because obviously it's of a dead swan and dead game with an excited spaniel looking on. But nevertheless, it's a fine painting. Around the walls are three, there's another important painting which I think comes up next, which is of Geordie's family, the Earls of Pembroke. They were his cousins at the time of Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. It's an extraordinary study in perspective, and it was at Tybalt's Palace. Tybalt's Palace was actually burnt down, but it was a much lauded and admired house north of London, not far from where Hatfield is today. And you've got Geordie's ancestors, the Earl of Pembroke and his son, the boy in the little red dress. And next door you've got King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. So it's just testifying to the importance of the family. The next paintings which I wanted to share with you are in fact the Canalettos. And it's a great thing for Geordie and I to share with you, because actually we began a wonderful Viking cruise not far from Venice. We went to Venice, and a little bit out of Venice, we boarded a cruise ship and we went on a beautiful cruise down to Istanbul. We, I'm afraid, sent postcards back to our families, but luckily for us, either the second or the third Earl brought back 3 beautiful paintings from Venice, which are now quite high up on the walls in this particular room. They don't have a huge amount of light, so it's a very good thing to admire them in the daylight. There's no ceiling lights here. My mother-in-law decorated the room, and to redo it with all the picture lights is perhaps something I'm not going to tackle at the moment. The Canalettos are quite high up, but having said that, the light is very clear. We've got some UV protection on the windows, and I just hope people enjoy being in this room and looking at them. Today, this room is called the smoking room, and the ceiling is painted a flat white, so that if there was cigar smoke in here, you could just paint the ceiling again. And in fact, Geordie's grandfather, the 6th Earl, was a keen cigar smoker. He didn't smoke many. He smoked very good Cuban cigars. Today, we actually do have a Highclere Castle cigar, so if he'd known, he'd be smoking that today. Before the smoking room, it was a room full of Egyptology. The 5th Earl kept his collection of Egyptology in this room. And before that, it was a breakfast room. And I guess before that, it might have been a drawing room. So this room has been reused by the family in many different ways. In some ways, for Geordie and I, it's a sitting room. It's a very comfortable room with great big leather sofas, comfortable pillows, cushions to sit against, and the dogs obviously feel very much at home in it. It's a place to have afternoon tea, and it's a place just to sit and admire some of the works of art, the china vases. And in the corner over there is a wonderful Pietra Dura table. The Pietra Dura work is apparently from the 16th century, and it's inlaid in a slightly later table, but there's about 17 different scenes, so it's a really special piece of furniture. It's also made from marble. It's unbelievably heavy. Above it is a painting of Queen Henrietta Maria, married to Charles I, the one English king to have been executed. And again, they're both in a painting the other side of the door. So there's kind of a 17th century story through here. And that's very appropriate because it was in 1679, in the time of Charles I's son, that Geordie's family acquired Highclere, the house and its estate. And it was his Robert Sawyer Herbert who bought this estate at the time, left the house and the estate to his grandson, Robert Herbert. And it was Robert Herbert who created the avenue in which I was standing a little bit earlier today, and built perhaps 12 follies, of which we still have 6 remaining, and it might be fun to show you some of the follies in the future. In this room are quite a few of the paintings they brought to Highclere in that time. 39 paintings were listed as coming to Highclere in 1679, and amazingly, we still have 25 of them. And I'm not quite sure because I haven't counted, but there's still quite a few of those paintings in this room. It's painted a very pretty terracotta colour, so I hope it sets it off well. And we've got a lovely new carpet which we bought full of terracottas and golds to go with it, which luckily we did just before the lockdown recently. If we use it as a sitting room, Geordie's grandfather used it as a room in which to play bridge in the winter. And there's a wonderful games table in here, and he played bridge, and he had drinks with his friends, and he really held court in here. It's also called the smoking room because the fire smokes. so it's there was always an electric bar fire in here, and I think this is a room that my husband Geordie much remembers meeting his grandfather in. And I guess as a little boy sitting on one of these huge leather sofas, you'd have been entirely lost. I think the 6L hung some of his favourite paintings in here. We have swapped some of them round, and we've actually hung a small Van Dyck to one side of the Jan Phoenix in this room. The small Van Dyck was a painting which was worked up into the huge painting which hangs at Wilton House, where Geordie's cousins live today. So it's an extraordinary work of art to have here, and a great memento of a very famous painting from one of the most extraordinary portrait artists probably in the world still today. The bulk of his collection is, of course, owned by the Queen, and we're lucky to have 2 or 3 of his paintings still here. This room as well now we tend to use for gin receptions and for part of the grand tour when people come around the castle, and for our own private weekends. It's a lovely room to open up en filade with the drawing room and to perhaps have some liqueurs and some coffees and some teas after supper. You open the French windows and you look south across to the Sidon Hill, which lies, I suppose, 2 miles to the south of here, across green lawns lit by the sunlight. And it's such a privilege to be looking out of the windows today at the hillside behind. And you've got Heaven's Gate, one of Robert Herbert's follies, at the top of it. So it's a very lucky place to sit. A little bit earlier, the 2 dogs were sitting out of the window, sitting out of the French window, looking outside wistfully. I think they'd rather be running around outside and heading up to the hill behind. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour around paintings, history, a room, and some of Geordie's family's history, and a room which perhaps you hadn't seen before. But I very much hope you've all got some questions for me today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Carnarvon. We have a question here from Murray in Sandrise. Have any plants from Canada been planted here?
Oh, Murray, how very nice to have that question. Obviously, there's a really special connection with Canada, given that quite a bit of the bill which created the Dominion of Canada was written here in 1865, 1866, the beginning of 1867, just over 150 years ago. And the people of Canada, you've very kindly given us the most beautiful Canadian maple tree. So what is more appropriate with a wonderful plaque to commemorate it? It's in the middle of the East Lawns, so you can't miss it. And I can't thank you enough for such a wonderful tree. And it's doing really well. I always go out and look at it and check up on it because it matters a lot. But thank you.
We now have a question from Alana, who's in Jersey City. She's asking, where does the name Highclere come from?
The name Highclere, Alana, comes from, I think high being on a high chalk escarpment and clear from a clear view. So it's actually very clear from the name itself where it comes from, Highclere. The Latin is Alta Clara. So in the original Anglo-Saxon documents, it's referred to as Alta Clara, which soon became Highclere. The Anglo-Saxon documents were written in Latin and in Anglo-Saxon in 749 AD, and there's a few more charters which mention Alta Clara, and then it soon became Highclere.
We now have a question from Nancy in Cherry Hill. Do you offer space for public venues or celebrations?
Oh, we do. I can't wait to offer space for some parties. I think we've all been missing saying our friends and family. I hope we have quite a lot of room here. So I think initially the best thing to do is to offer smaller events with less people. And there is so much space within the large rooms that I hope people can feel comfortable and enjoy a glass of champagne or some canapes. And perhaps that's the better way to celebrate different events rather than seated at tables together. But I'm really hoping there'll be some great birthday parties, because that would be something for us to look forward to as well.
We now have a question from Marianne in Chaplin. She's asking, what is the oldest tree on the estate?
Marianne, what is the oldest tree? Well, that's quite a hard one. The cedar trees look very tall and very large, and there are some redwoods which again look very tall and very large, but they are probably only about 250 years old. So I think the oldest trees are probably some of the oaks. They grow sometimes singly in the middle of a field, so they grow very thickly and stoutly. And they may well be 400 or 500 years old, which is extraordinary to think all they've seen. I do know that oaks fell from Highclere, built Winchester College and New College in the 14th century, which is sometime perhaps before the oldest oak, but it's clearly been a good place for trees. It's good, it's chalk, so it's the trees that suit the chalk soil. And the acidity. Beech trees do very well here, but they don't last as long. So I'm going to opt for an oak tree.
Marianne then asks a second question. Do you know who the ruler was when the oldest tree was a sapling?
Wow, who was the oldest ruler? Well, 400 years ago, I guess, was in the time of Charles I, perhaps. So Charles I was King of England in the 17th century. He was executed in 1649, succeeded by Cromwell and then his son eventually, Charles II. And that would have been the time that Geordie's family, as I've mentioned, acquired Highclere. And they, in fact, one of the first things they did was plant wonderful avenues of trees, and I think replant and plant up again some of the plantations. Trees and wood had such a value and were always respected. Sadly, we've lost some of their avenues. We've replanted one, but there were a few amazing avenues which Capability Brown kind of brushed away. But I wouldn't have minded having the odd one here still. They would have been magnificent to canter along on a horse or something.
Thank you, Lady Carnarvon. We now have a question from Lisa, who is in Millstone. Can you present a virtual tour of the castle, and can we go back to other Viking episodes?
Well, Lisa, we have done a virtual tour of the castle, and we presented it as an app, and it goes behind the scenes and into places that you don't see. We go up to the tower and we do a virtual tour from the top of the tower, and we go out to some of the estate and we share with you the extraordinary Rolls-Royce car which Geordie's grandfather owned, and we've brought back, and you see my husband driving it very well, obviously. So there's that way of sharing it, and I know that on an Apple iPad or Apple iPhone it's incredibly easy to download, and I hope a way of getting to know what the house offers before you come, perhaps, or if you can't come, please think about having a look at it. That's the easiest way to get it. And I've forgotten the second part of the question because I'm a silly person. Oh, I know, how you can see Viking.TV. How could I forget that? Well, you can see all the previous episodes on Viking.TV. Just look for Fridays at Home, and please do have a look. And then ask, and please, why don't you email in as well and tell me where you would like next to see? That would be a great thing to do. It would help me, and I would love to show you where you would most like to see. Perhaps downstairs, perhaps our kitchens, I don't know. You tell me.
Thank you. We now have a question from Terry, who's in Rochelle. He's asking, when I come in 2021, how long do I need for tour and tea?
Thank you. When you come in 2021, and I'm so looking forward to seeing lots of visitors in 2021, we'll have some visitors this summer, I hope, and some through the autumn, and then pick up a little bit towards next summer.
I think Highclere is a whole day out here. The castle itself is well over an hour, depending how much time you want to spend. And there is, again, quite a lot of space here, and we're going to carry on making sure people feel that they have enough space and courtesy from other guests. The Egyptian exhibition is probably 40 to 45 minutes. The gardens are perhaps an hour and a half, and I don't think you should hurry your tea. And we have picnic afternoon tea boxes as well as afternoon tea, which is again perhaps 45 minutes. So I'm an accountant, so I can't add that well. So I don't know whether you are or not, but I'm sure if you add it all up, it's a really good 3 or 4 hours. And then there's the gift shop, and there's just time to hang out and chill and look at the views, sit under a tree. I think that's almost as important as doing anything.
Thank you. We now have a question from Mary in Florida. She's asking about the clock on the side table just over there.
Mary, it's quite a special clock. I know it's a German clock, and I think it's from the Victorian time, and it's one of the most favourite pieces of objet d'art, if you like, from Diana, our housekeeper. If there's one thing she had to choose, for some reason it's that clock, maybe because she looks after it so beautifully. On the mantel shelf, just under the Jan Phoenix, is another clock, which is one of my favourites, because it's got the sun, the moon and the stars on it. And it just appeals to me. I think it's the child in me.
Thank you. We actually have a lot of questions about the paintings that you were discussing throughout your talk. Are you able to elaborate any further on the paintings behind you and the one above the clock there?
The one above the clock is the Jan Phoenix, which is painted about 16 in the mid-17th century, and it's an Arcadian landscape. And as I said, for today's taste, it perhaps not is as much admired as some of the Impressionists, but Jan Phoenix is a hugely admired artist of his time, and many of his paintings are in many of the foremost galleries within Europe. The 3 pictures by Canaletto or of his school above me are always a favourite. And either side of the Jan Phoenix are some older 17th century paintings of cows and cattle grazing in Arcadian fields. So I think it's about the landscape and the animals, and it's about a little bit about Geordie's family, and it's about how we've hung the paintings together so they're interesting to see in their different groups when you come round the castle. So there is a theme of older paintings in this room. The coving above the door is Georgian. It's not Victorian, it's not Charles Barry. It's from one of the earlier transformations of the house. In Robert Herbert's time, it would have been an Elizabethan place house with more painted walls and panelling. In the Georgian times, they would have used the plasterwork which you're seeing within this room today. And it would have been a lovely breakfast room facing south as people came down. We don't need it as a breakfast room today, and so that's why it remains to be called the smoking room. Or perhaps it should be Lord Carnarvon's sitting room, because Lord Carnarvon's sitting room is now my rather messy study. So perhaps he'd like his own sitting room, and I can feel less guilty about my very messy study.
Thank you very much, Lady Carnarvon. We now have a question from Linda, who's from the Villages. She's asking, what is the significance of the screen behind you?
Linda, the screen used to sit in our dining room, and it is quite a valuable screen. And when Downton Abbey wanted to film in the dining room, it was, again, something we decided to move from the dining room, and it blocked where the staff came out from the servery into another room. And we thought the colours worked quite well in here, and it needn't be moved. So it's a painted leather screen. We then created some interesting canvas paintings of all the different follies for visitors to admire, hopefully in the dining room. They were a little bit too modern for Downton Abbey, who borrowed a painted screen again from a prop rental company. So there's a bigger story to your question than you might have thought. I think it looks very fine there, and it's just paintings of figures in a landscape. And again, it's probably 18th century.
Thank you. We now have a question from Sally, who's in Fort Collins. She's asking, what are the beautiful flowers behind you?
Sally, the flowers are lilies, and actually Hannah, who's part of my international filming team, kindly brought them in from the greenhouses today. They are very tall, and I hope they didn't stain her clothes too much from the stamens. And the scent of the lilies is just amazing in this room. I wish I could share it with you. So the lilies are raised within the orangeries and within the greenhouses, so I can bring them into the castle, and they're normally scattered around some of the rooms. So as visitors walk through, I hope they're a treat and a delight to look at, and the scent really carries through the castle.
I suppose this is a related question. Linda from Virginia Beach is asking, do you enjoy gardening?
Linda, I really do enjoy gardening. I don't have a huge amount of time at the moment, but actually last weekend, Geordie and I decided to go down to the Wood of Goodwill, and we spent a couple of hours weeding. I mean, that's the main thing you do as gardening, isn't it? Particularly at this time of year. Some of the circles in which we planted viburnum and philadelphus and buddleias, etc., had got some thistles. So Geordie and I were spending some time pulling out thistles. So it was a good job. I have to say there's an awful lot more to do. And we've got 2 gardeners at the moment, because Paul's on holiday, working in the secret garden, trying to prepare and plant out the annuals and water some of the sunflowers and the plants that we have put out. So I hope they will make a wonderful show in July and August when we're open again.
Thank you. Lady Carnarvon, Betty is asking from Colonia, are there any flowering trees at the moment?
Betty, there are going to soon be some flowering trees. I'm looking for the tulip trees. We've got 2 tulip trees, one which my number 6 sister Georgie and her husband planted when they got married here, and another which was planted probably by Geordie's 3 great-grandfathers, the 2nd or 3rd Earl, which is much, much larger and is full of promise for many white flowers. So it's just tending to be the tulip trees, in that the lime trees have flowers, but they're less obvious than some of the tulip trees with its white flowers. But I'm looking forward. I go out in the morning with the dog sometimes, wondering what I'm going to see. And I might try and take some photographs and put them on my Instagram.
That would be really lovely. We now perhaps have a final question from Kay Laurel from Texas. They're asking, is Highclere Castle open for public viewing?
Oh, yes, thank you from Texas. And I also thank you in Texas because you're buying so much of our gin. So that is simply wonderful as well. But thank you. But we do hope to be open, and from July onwards, for July and August, we're going to open later in September. We've got some lovely tours we're curating for the autumn. And again, we're beginning to put our diary up for the next 18 months to help those who are trying to extend the horizons of their travels and planning and visitors, including with Viking cruises, obviously. But thank you so much for your questions. It's one of the parts I enjoy most from Fridays at home at Highclere. Next week, I'm going to be in the Monk's Garden and showing you the lavender and the orangery and perhaps some roses. Some of them will be out, and I would love to share some amazing borders there. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing you next Friday. Thank you for joining this Friday.